Hello, everyone. I'm Desiree Thomas, a librarian from Columbus, Ohio, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to Friendship First. This panel dives into stories filled with loyalty, laughter, and the unforgettable magic of those formative first friendships. And now I'm excited to introduce you to our panelists. Each panelist will give us a short synopsis of their new book. So I would like to welcome Jim Benton and his book, Clyde.
Hi, I'm Jim Benton. This is my book, Clyde. It's about a bear who dreams of being bad, and he discovers through a friendship with a juvenile delinquent butterfly that being bad is not always as good as it sounds.
Sounds wonderful and hilarious. Our next author is Jane M. Flynn, and she'll introduce her book, Griffin Speaker.
Yeah, I'm Jan M. Flynn,
Jan.
and that's okay. Griffin Speaker is my debut novel, so I'm very excited. And it is the first book in a middle grade series, which releases on May 5th from Disney Hyperion Books. So here's the cover. The book will be in stores on May 5th. And Rain is the main character of this book. She is an orphan who is born into the lowest rung of her rigidly hierarchical society in a land called Griffin Land. And when she bonds with the last wild griffin, it gives her the opportunity to change her fortune, but it also may overturn her entire social order.
Wow, sounds so exciting.
Thank you.
And our next author is Laekan Kemp, and she's going to introduce the Chismosas Only Book Club.
Hi, everyone. I'm Laekan, and I'm the author of the Chismosas Only Book Club, which is a novel that is part prose, part graphic novel, and it's about four friends whose top secret book club is the glue keeping them together during their freshman year of high school. One of the characters, Kat, her family owns the local bookstore, which is actually haunted by the ghost of her four times great grandmother and also the original owner of the bookstore, Milagro. And as the girls face various challenges within their friendship and their personal lives, the ghost of Milagro sends them the exact book they need at exactly the right time. So there's this element of magical realism that is just so much fun. But my favorite thing about this story is that the books that are sort of divinely delivered to the Chismosas are real books from the current Latinx literary canon. So after readers finish the Chismosas Only Book Club, they can go on to read the same books that the characters did, which I think is the most magical part.
Oh, what a wonderful gift to give your readers. It's kind of awesome.
Yeah, hopefully they'll keep on reading
Oh,
after
yeah.
they finish Chismosas.
And our next author is Erin Yoon, and her book is Pippa Park Raises Her Game.
Hi, my name is Erin Yoon, and I'm the author of Pippa Park Raises Her Game, which is a book about a Korean American girl named Pippa who receives a mysterious basketball scholarship to a local private school and becomes determined to use that opportunity as a chance to reinvent herself, both to impress her fancy new friends as well as an impossibly cute crush on the side. It's a book about new friendships and first crushes and family relationships, but above everything else, it's about one girl who, in trying to fit in, learns that maybe she's meant to stand out instead.
Well, welcome to all of our authors. You have all written some wonderful, amazing books. The first question goes to Jim Benton. So, the humor in Clyde works on different age groups. How did you go about creating content that engages different audiences?
I have 24 nieces and nephews because my wife's Catholic. So I'd say habla child, and I have kids of my own. So plus I was a kid for a brief period of time. So I kind of know like where to direct the humor. And I think that actually like if you very often if you're doing something that makes a kid laugh, you might very well be making the adult laugh too, because many of them also started out as children. And so you're sort of you've got sort of a head start on that.
Yes, I found the turtle to be like my humor style because I kept thinking of Mel's Diner. She was kind of funny and sarcastic in a cute way. And then Clyde, of course, is perfect for that middle grade audience.
Yeah. He starts out pretty abusive, but he does get a little bit better.
That butterfly helps him out.
Yeah.
The next question is directed at Jan M. Flynn. So the world building in Griffin Speaker features a social hierarchy that is complex and interwoven with fantasy characters. So which came first, the world or the characters, and how did you know where to place Rain in this world?
You know, when I thought about your question, it's a great question. I really had to go back to what made me write this book. It was a story that just knocked on my door and wouldn't let me alone until I wrote it, and that really had to do with a long struggle I've had with my passion for social justice, but also my position as, let's face it, a white woman in America with a lot of unearned and very often unrecognized privilege. And then during the COVID lockdown, I read two nonfiction books that really, they didn't just open my eyes, they made it impossible to unsee what they'd shown me. And that was Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, and Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us, SUM, What Racism Costs Us and How We Can Prosper Together. And so I was driven to write a story that explored not racial divisions, because that specifically, because again, that wasn't really, I felt like my role, but I wanted to talk about what happens when human beings fall into the trap of creating unfair, arbitrary, and unjust social systems, which is heavy stuff. But as one of my heroes, Madame L'Engle, said, you have to write the book that wants to be written. And if the book is too difficult to write for grown-ups, you write it for children. So I wanted to write a story that was adventurous and exciting and was set in a fantasy world that has lots of flaws, but also contains lots of wonder and lots of possibility, because so does ours. And I've always had a thing for griffins, who for thousands of years in multiple mythologies have been considered fierce, loyal protectors and guardians. So I thought, well, what if a girl at the very bottom of a very rigid hierarchical caste system who is fated for a life of drudgery befriends a wild griffin? And that sets off a chain of events that threatens the whole social order. And then I thought, well, if her world, then I had the main character, Rain, but if that world contains griffins, which are really kind of a hybrid of lions and eagles, wouldn't it have other hybrid winged creatures like hen bunnies and bamsters and fluttermice? And so I kind of kept going from there, and that led me to Griffinland.
Well, that is such a wonderful collaboration. I think that the relationship between Rain and the Griffin was the sweetest connection.
Oh,
The readers really bond with the Griffin, but also with Rain and her courage. So I thought it was an excellent vehicle to talk about social hierarchy, but in a way that's definitely accessible to middle grade children.
thank you.
The next question goes to Laekan Zia Kemp. So the girls in the Chismosas only book club are all having growing pains. Can you talk about how you write flexible friendships that are experiencing difficult shifts during puberty? Puberty is hard.
It is so hard. Yeah. And the problems that each girl has in the story are as varied and unique as their personalities. Kat gets her period for the first time, and it ends up being a much worse experience for her than it is and was for her friends. Then her cousin Sophia is closeted and trying to find a balance between keeping the peace with her bigoted abuela and finally being herself. Then there's Madi, who is reunited with a long lost family member, which I won't spoil, but it brings up a lot of complicated feelings for her. And then Anna is dealing with crippling anxiety worsened by her mother's ridiculously high expectations for her as the oldest daughter. I think when I was creating the friendship dynamic between the Chismosas, I was trying to both be realistic, but also a little idealistic about how friends can and should show up for each other in the face of those kinds of problems. The girls do have a falling out, which I think is a natural part of the relationship cycle, especially because they're in a new school and in a new phase of their lives. And we all know that change often creates friction. So it was important for me to show that. But I also wanted to model for readers like what unconditional love between friends actually looks like, even when you're young and don't necessarily have all of the tools in your emotional toolkit. It's still possible to approach others with compassion and understanding and to be a great friend that people can count on.
I really loved the friendships in your book, mainly because they were real. It wasn't glossed over. It's like everything is not fixed. Everything is, it is this a reality a lot of kids are actually experiencing. So to have that in book form, I think it's like a balm or something
Yeah.
that you can take and read and be like, oh, and to your point about being idealistic, it gives them something that this could happen, something to hope for, or maybe even create in their own lives.
Yeah,
So,
something to strive for. I mean, there's definitely a lot of mess amongst their friends group, but I also think working with four POVs and four distinct characters, they're able to like take turns in terms of how and when they support each other. And because of their different personalities and their different strengths and weaknesses, they have different things to offer one another. And so one girl in the group might not be the best person to comfort another during a specific situation. But there's someone else who like has the ability to do that. And so, yeah, throughout the story, there's at least always someone that they can count on. And then, of course, we find a resolution in the end that I hope is inspiring.
yes. So the next question goes to Erin. So being a basketball player is a big part of Pippa's identity. So did Pippa's love of basketball appear to you before her backstory? And what was it about the game of basketball that made you want to include it in her narrative? Oh, you're muted, I think.
Thank you. That was a really interesting question for me to actually think about, just because it's been a while since I wrote the outline. So I had to put myself back in that space, and I realized that I think Pippa did love basketball basically from the start. It wasn't the first detail that emerged, but it was actually pretty close in terms of like it came to me at the same time as her backstory and her personality and what she looked like. But even though I knew almost immediately that she was going to be a basketball player, I think it was also almost like an inconsequential detail at the time, where it's just like I knew I wanted her to be super passionate about a hobby, and it didn't matter so much to me what that hobby was. It could have been like interpretive dance or ping pong or like things like that. But I just wanted her to be obsessed and passionate about something because I knew that would give me something to write about that would drive her forward. And in the end, I kind of defaulted to basketball partially because I wanted her to play a sport because I'm not a sporty person. I'm not athletic. And I wanted like to challenge myself to write about a hobby that I really like am not about in this current day. But I did play basketball when I was in middle school, so I also kind of gravitated toward that because I was like, at least I know some of the terms and I know the dynamic of playing middle school basketball. And I also just thought it was a better sport than say like volley, like tennis or something like that, where you're not like on a team. I thought like the team dynamic of the basketball team and her friend group was something that was really fun for me to play around with and kind of show like the drama in their friend group and how that played out on court as well.
I really loved how basketball was the thing that she was the most confident in, and how
Aw.
that was where she was just
Yeah, totally.
fully herself. And I was like, oh, she's like, get on the court, and I could feel it. I am not a basketball person. For me, it was volleyball, but I
Oh no.
still had that same vibe. So I thought that really will resonate not only with realistic fiction readers, but basketball fans at the same time. So,
Yeah.
our next question, we're going to go to graphic novels, which are a mainstay, I know, in our library collection. So this question is directed to Jim first and then to Laekan. You both use the graphic novel medium to keep readers engaged. How do you believe the graphic novel medium can increase or encourage a big readership?
I think it's, when they say like, a picture's worth 1,000 words, that you can actually get a lot across in a drawing that you can't get across necessarily with just dialogue or just narration. And there's some things that can be like in this shot here where you see Grammy Turtle being tossed disrespectfully into the lake. Like just the word disrespectfully doesn't really sum it up the way that just being hurled, like a rock does. And I think that that's one of the things that graphic novels can do is they give you more of the story, more of the joke.
I would agree. It is the action that you're physically seeing along with the text that gives you different entry points.
Yeah. And sometimes even the contrast. I mean, she's kind of like talking calmly there while she's being hurled.
And the next spread that we have up is Laekan's. Oh, it was a welcome to hell for me.
Yeah, so I really wanted the Chismosas Only Book Club to be a bridge book for kids who love graphic novels, but maybe also want to go more in depth and spend a little bit more time with the characters they love, which I think reading prose really allows. One of the characters, Mari, is not the biggest reader. She's kind of in the book club by default, but she loves to draw, and illustrating in her sketchbook is how she processes a lot of what she's dealing with emotionally, especially the things that she finds difficult to talk about out loud, like her mother's kidney disease and her complicated relationship with her father. So her chapters include and are sometimes sort of bookended by these graphic novel panels. Heidi Moreno is the artist, and her illustrations are just absolutely adorable and hilarious. And I can just picture kids being so engrossed in Muddy's inner workings. So while it's definitely a tactic on my part as a teacher who like wants more kids reading, it's also meant to be a celebration of those kids who are just like Muddy, who are creative, who are visual learners, maybe reluctant readers, maybe English language learners. I wanted an entry point into the story specifically for them. And those sections just turned out so special that I think all readers are going to fall in love with them.
I would totally agree. And it's also the hardcore tagline that unites all of them. And it's like, it's both a way of seeing physical emotion, but also getting text with it. So even readers who are themselves artists, I think will find an entry point into this book. So again,
Yeah, there's a lot of like inside jokes and little Easter eggs that you only get from the graphic novel sections because they're straight from Mari's personality and her sense of humor and how she sees the world. And I do think visual mediums work really well in that way. There's just like a cleverness that you can exhibit with a visual medium that sometimes it's just too straightforward when you're sharing it through text. So yeah, those sections they're hilarious.
yes, and they also give another entry point. I just think, and it shows that if you are more visual, there's a space for you. So I think that's really cool too.
Yeah, and then if you enjoy them, hopefully that's motivation for you to get through the prose chapters until the next Madi section. So it can help you build that stamina as well.
Wonderful. So our next question is about fitting in. And this question is directed at Laekan, Erin, and then Jan. Sophia, Pippa, and Rain are thrust into new environments where they are forming new relationships that cause them to examine old relationships differently. How do you write these character arcs without being didactic or preachy? So, Lakin, you're first.
Okay. Okay. Um, I think it can sometimes feel counterintuitive to create characters that make a lot of mistakes. But I feel like with middle grade especially, the messiness is so essential. I mean, at that age, kids are just discovering for the first time who they are and what they value and what they believe. And while that value system is sort of still in flux, it's so easy to make the wrong choice. And I think it's important to show that. But it kind of goes back to what I was saying before about wanting to strike a balance between what's realistic and what's idealistic, because ultimately again, probably as a teacher, like I do want readers to come away from my books having seen that journey of redemption, having seen these messy, imperfect people make mistakes and both live with the consequences of those mistakes while also striving to be better. So there is like a slightly didactic element for me, but I try to avoid any cheesiness by writing those things in a way that really rings true for that character. And for me, that's something that really happens in revisions, in that excavation process, and just drilling down into the core of who that person is and how they view the world and what those, essential wounds are. If I can just frame everything through that lens, then I think it rings a lot more true.
So next up, Erin.
Yeah, I think being preachy is really something in general I try to avoid in my writing. A lot of the times people will ask me what the moral or the great lesson that they're supposed to take away from Pippa is. And I think that in general it's a pretty positive, wholesome book, but I wasn't actually trying to write it that way. I just kind of wanted to focus on making Pippa a realistic human and kind of following the decisions she made and seeing like what choices and what paths she went down. And I think that her past, she is kind of like um flawed, and so she ended up forsaking some of her old friends for her new ones, and she ends up realizing that by the end of the book. And I think the way I avoided having that come off as didactic is just by like showing how clear it is that I love Pippa even when she's making these kind of grand mistakes. Like I still am like kind of viewing her and writing her with a lot of tenderness, and I hope that kids kind of take away like that it's okay to be flawed and it's okay to make mistakes and be messy because it doesn't make you a bad person. It just means you're a normal person who's making the same mistakes that everyone else does. And so I think that by just showing them that even if you make a mistake, you're not a bad person, right? It's like about your actions versus who you are as a person that I hope kind of cuts through any preachiness that might have otherwise leaked out. Yeah.
It didn't feel preachy at all. It felt like she came to a natural conclusion that she
I'm
had
so glad
made
to
a
hear
wrong
that.
step.
Yeah.
And then it's like, oh, I now have to fix this. How am I going to
Right,
fix
right.
this? Um, and to be kind of a character who owns their mistakes,
Yeah,
which
exactly.
is not something that you see all the time. I think that's what it kept it from being preachy or didactic. I really liked her as a character.
Well, thank you so much.
And Jan,
Well, I really appreciate being included with Laekan and Erin in this because they nailed it when it comes to getting across this, you know, the complexity of middle grade friendships without being preachy or didactic. And that's the last thing I ever want to do because I've spent a good chunk of my career as a middle school educator. And I know for certain that that is the last thing a middle grade reader wants. They do not want to be adult splained and they don't want to be told how to think or feel about anything. So I'm glad that I am lumped in with people who have done that well because one of my main goals as a writer is always, whether I'm writing for adults or younger readers, is always to trust the reader to draw their own conclusions. But Rain does obviously get shoved out of her familiar circumstances, and especially when she's thrown together with Lady Orla, who's a girl from the very highest rank of Griffinland society. And she finds that she has assumptions and prejudices that she wasn't even aware of that are challenged. And meanwhile, there's her childhood buddy Twig, the boy she's grown up with. And at first, you know, kind of in contrast with Orla, he sort of makes her cringe. She feels a little ashamed of him, and yet he comes through for her in her darkest moments. So she ends up contending with a lot of feelings that she doesn't understand or even approve of. Um, and she, has to wrestle with them, in the midst of all these other things that she's facing with and try to make sense of them. And that meant, for me, it meant really trying to write from Rain's heart and gut because very often she registers those emotions in her body before she registers them in her thoughts. So, again, my takeaway, what Erin said, you're not a bad person for having bad feelings or feelings you don't approve of, feelings that aren't necessarily nice. It's a real struggle. It's not comfortable for anyone, but it's very human and very normal. And I believe it's necessary. It's part of our growth.
I would agree. There's a you are yet evolving
Mhm.
that I kept feeling when I was reading Griffin Speaker, because every time what she had been taught, and then as she comes up against these different segments of society, and she's like, oh, it's not the way I was told or that I thought. And so you're constantly having to reassess and think about things differently. And Twig was so sweet. And he was always baking her stuff and making sure she had food. I'm like, that's a real friend. Won't
Twig
let you go hungry.
Twig is a good kid. He's a good guy.
So our next question is actually about pressure. So this one is for Erin and for Laekan. Minna and Minna's sister and Anna's mother both use pressure to encourage the upward mobility of Pippa and Anna. Can you talk about how the mother-daughter or big sister, kid sister dynamic works or doesn't as a means for your character's self-actualization? So Erin is first.
So Pippa's actually inspired by Great Expectations by Charles Dickens. And so I kind of stole a little bit of the family dynamic and that sister dynamic from that book because in the book, Pippa's, raised by his own sister and her husband. And while I was reading Great Expectations, there actually started to be some like fun parallels between old English society and like some aspects of just Korean American culture that kind of helped form the outline and kind of inform the relationship between Mina and Pippa. And at the same time, the books are from Pippa's perspective. So she often sees that harsher side of Mina, because it's coming from her viewpoint, and she's kind of like, oh, Mina's so unfair. She has like no humor. She's like, really like laying down the hammer. When in reality, Mina has a sense of humor. She's also trying to do her best, and she's not trying to like overly pressure Pippa. So I think that there's kind of a fun dynamic there where it's like Mina is doing her best as a sister who wasn't necessarily expecting to raise Pippa in this way. But we don't always see like that tenderness through Pippa's lens. But at the end of the day, I think that she loves her sister both as a sister and kind of as a pseudo mom. And it was really just fun to kind of like play with that dynamic from Great Expectations and kind of modernize it a little bit.
I feel like Minna's husband
Yeah, Jungwoo, yeah.
softened Minna. And it was that part, seeing their interactions and how he supported her, but also supported Pippa.
Yeah.
So
Oh, thanks. It's also like the funnest relationship to write. I love those two.
Laekan?
So when I was coming up with what those pain points would be for each character, I felt like I definitely needed one of them to represent for the oldest daughters of immigrant parents. It's a dynamic that I feel like is getting a lot more attention and frankly a lot more scrutiny these days as millennials in particular are like sharing their experiences on social media about what it's really like to carry that kind of responsibility, how suffocating it can be, how detrimental to one's mental health. So it's definitely a relevant topic of conversation right now among many communities of color. But when we meet Anna, she's right in the thick of it. She's only 14, and so she still has a ways to go before she's fully in control of her own life. But we can already see her yearning for it. We can already see her starting to form her own identity separate from the expectations her mother has for her. And of course, this is like the quintessential teenage experience to some extent, but the familial ties and that sense of responsibility and duty, I think, adds a whole other layer of difficulty for Anna. So much so that when she gets moved out of her pre-AP English class and placed in gen ed, she has a full-blown panic attack. But I feel like once she has that first brush with her own perceived failure, it almost kind of liberates her a little bit so that she can start to discover who she is outside of all of those constraints.
And she can admit what's really going on and ask for help, which that was not her MO. She just put more and more on her plate. It felt like it was like very tension driven. So I was just you're rooting for all of them, but I was really rooting for Anna to get the support she needed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think in her chapters, there's definitely this visceral undercurrent of anxiety that's not quite as present in the other girls' POVs, even though they are all dealing with different fears, which I know we're going to get into more. But Yeah, she is probably the character that I have like just the biggest tender spot for because of just all that she is struggling with and how all-encompassing and completely overwhelming it is.
Well, now we are going to talk about fear, action, and inaction. So, fear and courage are reflected differently in certain characters in your story. Can you talk about the ways fear affects the characters in your novels? So, we're going to start with Jan, and then Jim, Laekan, and then Erin.
Well, for Rain, Rain has a lot of misbeliefs about herself because of where she is in society and because she is supposed to work underground in what are called the tubes, kind of like mines. Um, she's terrified of small, dark, cramped spaces, and that's something that nobody in her rank even wants to admit, because if you do admit that, the health authorities come in and make you take this horrible medicine that just sort of the med that doles you out. She doesn't want to be somebody who has tube terror, and it makes her think that she doesn't come right out and say so, but she thinks of herself as less than, and that's part of it. She thinks she's kind of a coward, but uh, when she is confronted with, um, a threat to someone or something that she cares about, she has tremendous courage. She doesn't always recognize it. But when she first sees the Griffin writers, but they're going after someone who is not really a criminal, and she wants to come to their defense, she speaks up to her mean school teacher. Um, she and she as she goes through the story, she has more and more experiences of standing up for what she really cares about, and that allows her. She never stops being afraid, but it allows her to transcend her fear to the point that when she confronts the big, scary, the big Bahuna at the climax of the novel, she's almost like somebody on a battlefield. It's not that she's not afraid; she's gone beyond fear. And I am fascinated by having been a very anxious kid myself. I am always interested at um, what resources someone draws on to surpass fear. What is more important than fear? Because there's always something more important than what you're afraid of.
Yeah, that fear almost for Rain turns into courage in a lot
Mm-hmm.
of instances. Like in certain instances where she's facing down like the Griffin riders,
Mm-hmm.
like just because she's trying to protect someone that she cares about.
Right.
So that gives her kind of chutzpah.
And that's kind of, again, not to preach, but I would like kids, readers to come away with the sense that um, fear and courage are often the flip sides of each other.
Well, Jim, Clyde,
Yeah.
he's afraid.
Well, yeah, Clyde's afraid of not being cool, I think, or not being tough enough. And that sort of thing, that's what drives him to think that he needs to go to Grizzly City and he needs to be a bad guy because he doesn't want to be a good guy. He sort of romanticized the idea of being bad. As far as the fear in the rest of the book, Melissa Sue is probably not afraid of anything. She can beat up a grizzly bear, but she is probably afraid of her former self because she does confess that she used to steal cars when she was just a caterpillar. And I think that that's probably what happens. Clyde faces that fear eventually when he realizes he has to do the right thing, which he really resents. And I think that sometimes we have a voice inside us, our conscience, that tells us the right thing to do. And then there's another part of it that's like, oh man, really? But we still do it anyway. We're still driven forward by that. And that's probably the prevailing fear in the book.
Yeah,
Fear
especially
of not being cool enough.
well, when you get beat up by a second grader who's a butterfly, and kind
Right.
of
Right.
definitely
Yeah.
that's not.
Yeah, and he even tries to lie about that. He said she was doing kung fu.
Yes, super hilarious, but yeah, still fear-based.
Yeah.
So, Lakin?
Yeah, so speaking of fear, as I was kind of touching on earlier, Anna in particular is definitely dealing with a fear of failure. I think for Kat, she's afraid of not being in control, which is why having an irregular period is especially hard for her. Her parents also have sort of an off again, on again relationship, and that lack of consistency, I think, is really the source for her deep-seated need for control. Then there's Sophia, who is really afraid of rejection. She knows her Wella would disapprove of her queerness, which is why she hides it from not just her, but also her parents. And then for Maddie, she's afraid of loss, of losing her mother, who was recently diagnosed with kidney disease. Her mother actually shared the news with her while she was reading a book, which is why now she's not really into reading anymore because it's become sort of this reminder of this really difficult moment. And I think it's in the girls' like desperate avoidance of these fears coming true that things get really messy. We all know growth is not linear and these girls make plenty of mistakes, but I think when they choose to try again, that's where they're exhibiting courage. So it's not always this big grand thing, but instead it's in those small moments when they just don't give up even when they are scared, even when sometimes their worst fears have come true, they keep going, which I think is the bravest thing any of us can do.
I would agree. And it's also them pushing aside that fear to reach out to the others in the Chismosas book club. Because it's like hard to reach out when you've already done something not quite right and you're looking for connection. And I just thought that was beautifully done.
Yeah, well, I think community can give you courage. When you know that you always have a safe place to land and a support system that is always going to have your back, then you know it's okay to make mistakes. And maybe shame comes from other places, but for them, it doesn't come from each other. And so they know they always have like a space where they can be vulnerable.
Awesome. Erin?
Yeah, alongside like everyday fears like failing math class, Pippa, I would say, has a deep fear of alienation, a fear of not living up to expectations. She fears blending into a crowd, but also fears sticking out of it. And I would say, in general, her internal thoughts kind of mirror mine. We're both super overthinkers and over worriers, and we're flooded with anxiety even when things are going well. And I kind of think of fear for both her and me as almost like kinetic energy versus potential energy, where kinetic fear is almost like you're falling off a cliff, like it's already happening. And then potential fear is like you're looking over the edge of that cliff, being like, oh God, I hope I don't fall. And for both of us, I almost think that like the fear of falling is almost scarier than the part where we're actually falling. Because it's only once you've hit rock bottom or you're like on your way that you can kind of start to own up to the mistakes you've made and kind of repair those things. And so I would definitely say that Pippa has a lot of fears, just like I do, yeah.
It's almost like also it seemed to me that Pippa had a fear of being seen, like her
Same, yeah.
life in totality, like her life outside of the rich
Right.
school. Like there are certain things that she was hiding from both sides of herself.
Yeah. She wants to be Instagram perfect at all times, kind of.
Don't we all? Well, not really. But yeah, so that's a hard thing. Um, so our next question is about family dynamics, and this one is for Jim, Erin, and Jan. So Rain, Clyde, and Pippa have non-traditional family structures. What do you want your readers to take away from these unique familial constructs? So we're going to start with Jim first.
I think I mean mostly what I want is I want my reader to laugh. And I like the absurdity that, his grandmother's a turtle, his brother is a worm, kind of his adopted sister is a butterfly. And so I mean maybe what they take away from the his family is that even though like he resents his grandmother, he resents her advice, in the end, when it comes right down to it, he does have to, like, he just decides that he has to do the right thing and free her from fish jail. And he makes like he's really grateful to Melissa Sue. So at least he sort of goes through the motions, even though he's kind of not really that way. And I think that if they see anything in Clyde, what they see is like a character who is bad fundamentally, but he still has some good qualities, right? And most of the characters I write in my books all the time are characters with bad qualities, because that's sort of what makes me laugh, and I think that makes kids laugh too. And there's some redemption. There's usually something that improves a little bit, but I think for a lot of us, our morality is kind of a flickering light bulb. Sometimes it's all the way on, sometimes it's all the way off. George Carlin one time says, we all want to think of ourselves as a good person, but when we make a sandwich, we always take the bread from the middle of the bag. And so, we can never really get quite to that divine level of being. So maybe I'm showing them that as bad as you are, kids, hey, we're all about that bad.
Yep. And it's funny. I love he Clyde even says, "Is it weird that my grandmother is a turtle?" He says that, and I'm just like to point it out, but then also be like, "Okay, you're my grandma,
Right.
found family or no."
Right.
So, Erin?
Yeah, I mentioned before that Pippa was inspired by Great Expectations, and that's kind of where I took that specific familial structure from, because Pip was also living with his sister and her husband. But in the original book, Pip was like his parents were dead, and I just thought that was a little too grim for the book that I was writing, and so I kind of just decided, instead of like offing both of Pippa's parents and having it be kind of dark, that her mom would still be around. She would just be back in Korea. And I kind of chose that both because it was a very simple answer to like mimicking the original structure of the book, but it's also one that really happens and one that gave Pippa a little bit more emotional depth instead of just being like, whining about like not passing her test or things like that. She also had like more serious issues in the background. But I didn't have an exact lesson for readers to take away. I just think it's a good thing to show families that aren't just two parents and a kid, because that's the reality of the world. So it's a reflection of kind of that.
Yes, and it gave it's like a window into another life, right? So it's
Yeah.
another entry point. So I thought that was cool as well. Jan?
Yeah, well, again, what Erin said, what Jim said, as with my time as a middle school educator, and now I volunteer in the CASA program, helping kids navigate the legal system when they're in foster care. It seems to me like there's as many, if not more, kids living in non-traditional family structures than what we think of as, standard. Uh, Rain certainly goes through that. She's a grub, but she's also an orphan. Her parents are dead. She's being raised by her aunt Willow in a menagerie. This weird sort of place where she's raising young wingeds for pets. But she does, and she has shame about that. But the fact is, she really does belong. And the takeaway I would want for kids is that family is really more a function of commitment and belonging than it is of DNA and last names. Um, and a family is where you feel the most at home. And it's like a house, or it's like a menagerie. It can change and it can grow and it can be added onto.
So that is going to be our last question. This has gone so fast. I could talk to you all for so much longer. So, a heartfelt thank you to our authors for their wonderful perspectives, and thanks to all of you for being a part of this session. Up next is a short break, so if you haven't already, make sure to visit the exhibit hall to browse the booths. Thank you for your time and attention, and for doing the good work of sharing these wonderful books with your readers.
Thank you.